Hello, everybody. Welcome to our Sleep In, our feature panel today. I am Julie Flygar, and I am the president and CEO of Project Sleep, and I'm tuning in to you all from Los Angeles, California. Let's see if we can try a gallery view here. There we go. And I'm so excited for you all to meet our expert panel today for this feature discussion on sleep and your space, and thinking about some of the factors, environmental factors that play in, and architecture factors. So this is just I have my dream panel here, and I'm just so excited for you to meet them. So I want you to just quickly say hi to everyone. We have Dr. Till Roenneberg joining us from Germany.
Hi, it's evening already here.
Yes, thank you for staying up for us. And we have Dr. Dayna Johnson.
Hello.
And where are you tuning in from?
I am in Atlanta, Georgia.
Awesome. And Eilís Finnegan. Hi, Eilís.
Hello, and I am in Chicago.
Awesome. Well, we're so excited for you to hear from everyone today. And as you guys are tuning in, please share where you are watching from. It's really fun to see how international our community is. I think last night we had people from Japan, Australia, across the US that were tuned in. So today's timing might be a little bit more convenient for our friends in Europe. So hopefully some of them are able to tune in today. So please share where you're watching from. And we're going to start with each of our panelists giving a quick overview of sort of their area of expertise as it relates to sleep in your space and your environment. So we're going to start with Dr. Roenneberg, and I'm really excited here. I have just received it yesterday. I've been watching a lot of his videos online, but also had to get the book that Dr. Roenneberg wrote, and hopefully someday I can have him sign this in person. I actually saw Dr. Roenneberg on social media. Someone else had taken a picture of the comment that you'd made in their book and how they cherish that. And I believe you said something to the effect of sleep is not the enemy of wake. It's the thing that makes it possible, or something like that.
Sleep does not take away from wake, it makes it possible.
I just love that. I just think that's such a beautiful message. So hopefully someday you're going to sign this for me. So Dr. Roenneberg is really an international leader on this topic of chronobiology, and we're just so lucky to have him with us. He is a professor of chronobiology at the Institute of Medical Psychology at Ludwig-Maximilian University. Is that correct?
Yeah, but we call it LMU. That's much easier.
LMU in Germany. And so please, without further ado, also very exciting that we have you here on the eve of our time change as we switch to daylight savings tomorrow. So we're really excited to hear what you have to share with us about, chronobiology and social jet lag. And so take it away.
Okay, I take it away, and I already criticize you. There is no time change. Time is not changed tomorrow, only the clocks. That's something that one has to really take into account when we talk about DST. But let me explain why I think you wanted me to speak on the topic of sleep and space, because one has to understand that besides being tired and having been awake for quite some time, there's another very important factor that controls when you are able to sleep, and that is the circadian clock, our body clock. And many people know that they have a body clock, but very few people know what drives this body clock and what sets this body clock and how variable it is and how much it differs between individuals. And I want to talk about this a bit. So I'm not going to go into the details of the circadian clock, but basically it is a 24-hour clock, or a circa 24-hour clock. It's a biological function, a biological program that produces an internal day. Now, why would one do that? One does that because one would like to predict things. It's one of the few biological functions that has been invented to actually predict things. Predicting things is very, very simple when you can predict things about the environment. If I would ask you to bet with me what the next lottery numbers are. It would be very hard for me to convince you that I know that. But if I would bet with you that the sun will come up tomorrow morning at a certain time, it would be very easy for me, and you shouldn't go into any bets with me, because that's something that we really can predict. And since our world is shaped into daily spaces of different temperatures, different light, different resources, different animals, different enemies, and so forth, our biology wants to predict what's going to happen. And in order to predict something, we know that if we have to catch a plane or a train, our clocks predict when this train will leave when we consult the clocks, so that we know when we have to leave. It's a prediction, because if it's not a prediction anymore, but past, we missed the train, or we missed the plane. So the internal clock does nothing else, but the external clock that we carry around on our mobiles or around the wrist, it predicts what is going to happen, and it structures the day into a certain structure. And the most important thing that one has to learn about this clock, that basically the only thing that can set this clock is light and darkness. And light and darkness have changed enormously over the past decades. Of course, not light and darkness have changed so much, but the way we use light and darkness. Now, in the old days, before we had an industrialization and before we had electrical light or artificial light, we had practically no light during the night after sunset. And we had an enormous amount of light when we went outside, which most of us did in that era, because we were agriculturally or otherwise occupied, and therefore we had to go outside. So if we go outside on a rainy day, we get about 10,000 lux or more. Lux is just a dimension that we use to measure light intensities. On a clear sky day, we get over 100,000 lux. Now, if we stay inside, which we have done for the past 100 years, because we are working either in factories or in offices, if we stay inside, we can be lucky if we get 400 lux. So it's a fraction of the light that we used to get during the day. But we are not so lucky to still get something like 100 to 200 lux after sunset, because we're switching on lights when our clocks used to have darkness. So the clocks are set by light and darkness. And if you have very strong light during the day and no light during the night, this is what we call a very strong Zeitgeber, time giver, to a signal for the clock to set itself. We have weakened that Zeitgeber enormously by not going outside during the day and by switching on light during the night. For most of us, that meant that our clocks had to become later in order to still synchronize to the 24-hour day. And that is always forgotten, although we all know it without thinking about it. Our clocks are so late that over 80% of the population need an alarm clock to wake up in the morning. Now, if you need an alarm clock to wake up in the morning, your biology hasn't slept to the end, because your clock is late and you have to wake yourself up in order to go to work, for example, or to school. Now, the important thing about this is that this is really light dependent. Our internal clocks cannot be set by the alarm that goes off on a mobile phone or any other alarm. It's light and darkness that set our clocks. And the variability in the population is very, very high. So each of us embeds itself, her or himself, into this light-dark cycle differently. The famous larks and owls. So larks embed their clocks early so that they wake up early, so that they fall asleep early at night and wake up early in the morning. And owls can't fall asleep early, and they can't by themselves get up late, get up early. They want to get up late. of course, the extreme larks and the extreme owls, which can be now 12 hours apart. Huge differences in how our individual clocks synchronize with the light-dark cycle. Of course, they are only the extremes. And there are many, many people in between, which I have started to call doves, because I don't know why we only call the extremes with bird names and the people, the majority in between not. So we have a very few extreme larks, we have very few extreme owls, and we have many, many doves in between, who all in one way or the other need alarm clocks to wake up. So most of the doves are quite late nowadays. Now this changes. This is not genetic and this is not learned, because if you take a normal urban population on a camping trip, all the late people become much earlier, and actually the very early people become later again, but we don't have to go there into that. But the distribution of larks and owls becomes very narrow and much earlier under the natural conditions. So what is important for you to learn concerning your sleep and your environment is that you have to be very careful with light and with darkness. Now, most people, for example, like to sleep in a dark room. I always say, don't do that unless you are an extreme lark and it is summer. Because extreme larks actually do wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and they need shading. But everybody else should actually try to sleep in with light coming into the bedroom, because if your brain doesn't know that the light has come up, it thinks it's still dark and still night, and it will become even later. So if you're a late type who sleeps in a dark room and sleeps in, you're making your clock even later. It's something which you don't want. So if you're able to sleep into the light, you are a true owl and you are allowed to. If you're not, you are just a procrastinating lark and you should go to bed earlier and get up earlier. That is one message I would like to get across. The other message is that we really have to change both the physics of our illumination and the architecture of our houses. Basically, we have to be able to go camping every day, even in the office, meaning we have to get the lights that we encounter when we go camping into the offices and buildings. That means, for example, we have to simulate what's going on outside by, for example, getting more light. However, I'm not a specialist, but it's the architects and the light specialists who have to do that. We have to get the light that arrives at the roof of a building. We have to get that into the ceilings of offices, so it's really bright and diffuse, like the light in the sky. But we also have to tune all illumination spectrally so that after sunset, and that's local sunset, that's sunset in Chicago or in Georgia or in Munich, local sunset should tune down the blue content of any artificial light and practically take it away, so that we just have enough spectral variability in the light so that we can see properly. But otherwise, take away every blue. We have to go camping on many levels so that we basically, my goal is that none of us needs an alarm clock in the future, and we can do that by either having very flexible work times or going camping all the time light-wise. So that's about what I wanted to say, and now I shut up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Roenneberg. I think this is just so fascinating. I'd never heard the term lux before. Is that the word? Is it L-U-X?
L-U-X, it's Latin for light.
Okay, I'd never heard that term before starting to watch some of your videos. And ever since, I've kind of become obsessed with making sure I'm getting outside more and getting some more natural sunlight during the day. So thank you just so much for sharing with our community. I think often, I think a lot of our community members have sleep disorders, and sometimes when your sleep's messed up, I haven't thought as much about some of these basic things, though, that could be possibly helpful to know about. And so we're going to make a really big switch from, well, one more question for you really quick before we switch. You have the larks, you have the owls, you have the doves. Now, what about people with sleep disorders? I mean, I'm thinking I'm maybe a peacock. I don't really know, but I think I'm pretty special. You have any sort
In what
of,
way?
well, because I'm special, because I have a sleep disorder. So
But besides that obvious point, in what way?
I just think peacocks are cool.
Yeah, but how do you translate peacocks into your sleeping habits?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't thought that far. I just
Okay.
thought they're really beautiful. So I was going to go with being unique.
Oh, you mean I should replace doves with peacocks?
No, I was just thinking that that maybe I'm not a dove because I'm probably a little bit different because of my having narcolepsy with cataplexy.
Okay, that is different. Yes, that's
Yeah.
why I was asking in what sense are you a peacock?
Yeah.
That's a big difference. Yes.
Yeah. So
But
I'm
let me add that many people I encounter and I help with sleep problems actually don't have sleep problems, but they are just not aware that they should. For example, take for example a person who comes to me and says, "I'm always tired during the day because I wake up in the middle of the night, and I'm very tired early in the evening." So it turns out that this woman was an extreme lark, but didn't know it. And so she thought she's waking up in the middle of the night, although it was her actual natural wake up time, because she related it to what most of the population does. And for that, it was, compared to that, it was the middle of the night.
right.
But once you are aware that it's your choice to go to bed at 8 o'clock in the evening or even at 7:30, or not because it's so exciting, but that you will wake up at 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, you are not a patient anymore, but you're somebody who knows I have a biology that wants me to go to bed at 7:30 or 8 o'clock, and I will wake up. It's not pathological, it's just normal, and I have it under control, because if it's boring, if my husband tells boring stories, I go to bed. But if there are lovely friends over, I don't. But that's a choice.
I love that. All right. Thank you so much. So we are going to switch from chronobiology to social epidemiology, or our sleep epidemiologist, Dr. Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an assistant professor at Emory's Rollins School of Public Health, and her research is aimed at understanding the root causes of sleep health disparities and their impact on cardiovascular disease by addressing the social, environmental determinants of sleep disorders and insufficient sleep. So we're kind of going from one end to the other. I mean, or just both so important. So Dr. Johnson, we're really excited to hear what you have to share with us about some of the social impacts on our sleep.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I'm really, really happy to be here, and it's an honor to be on a panel with all of you. And so, but I will say that I'm not so sure what I'm going to say is very different. I think our work really intersects. And so, in this arena of sleep disparities, I think about people who live in environments that are altered in some way. And so, thinking about inopportune light exposure and how that affects their sleep. So my work really identifies aspects of our household and neighborhood environment that may alter our sleep, and then thinking about the people who are forced to live in those environments because of social factors such as segregation, residential segregation, for example. And so one of the pieces of my work is really getting my colleagues and clinicians to think about how people are nested within environments. And so what do I mean by that? So if you take an individual, they are nested within social relationships, right? Friends, family, so on. And then they're nested within a home. And this was mentioned before in talking about the architecture of the home, which I'll come back to. So you live in a house or apartment or some type of dwelling. And then that is nested within a neighborhood environment. And then that environment has different exposures, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And then that is nested within certain institutions and within certain policies. So when we are giving suggestions to a person, we're usually thinking about that individual behavior. are they able, telling them, for example, sleep during the night or sleep in a dark environment. But we're not thinking about the types of environments they may live in. Is it safe for them to be in a dark environment? Are they living somewhere where they have control over the light? Are they living somewhere where they have control over temperature, for example? So in one of the studies that I have done in Boston, we found that people that lived in places like public housing may not have control over their temperature. And in the health behavior realm and thinking about sleep hygiene or healthy sleep practices, we talk about sleeping in an environment that's a comfortable temperature. So again, that suggests that you have some level of control over having your temperature set in a certain way. But if you live in a public housing, this may not be the case. And so taking this work and being able to translate it into policy and working with both people that live in these types of housing dwellings, as well as those that control the policies around these. So that's one point in thinking about how we're nested. And so if I'm prescribing something to you, I need to think about, can that actually work? And if not, I need to expand that in order to address these other social conditions, whether that's safety, for example. And so when I think about the environment, I think about several settings. And so to start at the larger one that we think about is like the neighborhood environment, and I call those contextual factors. And so I mentioned that we live in these environments that were intentionally designed in this way. So the patterning of environments are the result of race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, immigration status. So you can see the segregation of these environments based on historical laws. So things that happen like redlining, when people were forced to live in certain areas because they were denied mortgages in more affluent areas because of their race, for example. And so this has translated over generations. And so we still see the segregation in these areas. And the reason why this is important is areas that racial minorities are more likely to live, as well as those of lower socioeconomic status, so those of lower income. These are areas that tend to have more air pollution. So there are areas where there are more manufacturing plants that are potentially or maybe emitting certain pollutants into the environment, and we know that affects our breathing. So in thinking about sleep apnea, for example, is a large part of my work. And so we know that the air can affect that. So that's an obstruction in our airway, right? And so, so in my work, I look at things like income and where someone may live and how that predisposes them to certain exposures that may increase their risk for sleep apnea. So in addition to thinking about the air, we also have to think about the other pathway to sleep apnea, which is obesity. So if you live in an area that is a food desert and there's no opportunity or limited opportunity for fresh fruits and vegetables, you tend to eat more fast food. So again, your environment is shaping, these behaviors. And then you may be in an environment where it's not safe to walk, or there's a lack of sidewalks. You think about some rural areas, for example. So whether you're in an urban or rural environment, there can be different exposures that may affect your ability to engage in physical activity and healthy eating that could prevent obesity. But let's say you're in one of these areas where it's more promoting to obesity, and then that's another pathway that might lead to sleep apnea. And then the other piece that I think about for this higher contextual factor and thinking about policies are things like minimum wage. And so many times people will, look at me and say, why are you concerned about minimum wage as a sleep person? I'm concerned about it because that's going to affect whether or not you have multiple jobs, and multiple jobs may translate to you working more, right? So you might be have a day job and a night job. And so that can translate into a shorter sleep period, or it can also affect implementing a consistent bedtime with children, for example, if you're a parent. And we know that consistent bedtimes are important for healthy sleep practices for children. So I'm thinking about this at all these different levels, how our policies, again, can shape our individual behaviors. And so when I give talks, I usually show pictures of different environments and thinking about whether you're in an area that has a heavy police presence, there's a lot of violence or a lot of crime. That is going to affect whether or not you are able to comfortably sleep. And I often tell this story of my grandmother, who's now she passed many years ago, but she for a long period of time lived in an environment that was not safe. So she would sleep with her purse and all lights on because she wanted to make sure people knew someone was in the home, or she needed to leave, quickly. She was able to. So how could you comfortably sleep in an environment like that, right? And so also in these environments, they have brighter lights, which are intentionally designed in order to deter crime from occurring. So yes, that's great. We want to stop crime, so we put brighter lights in. But then what does that do for our sleep? So if you have these bright lights that are outside of someone's apartment shining in, it's going to interrupt their sleep cycle, right? And so we might have to think about, whether they are a lark or an owl and how much that may affect. But there are things that we can do to prevent that. There's shields that you can put on the light to make sure it's shining in a certain area and not into people's homes. So there's many things that we can do around that. So that's at the neighborhood level. And then if we think about like our work environments, and this was also mentioned. And so what was mentioned is in thinking about people or the goal, as Till mentioned, is for people to be able to sleep without an alarm clock. And that comes with privilege. And so honestly, I have that privilege, right? I can set my meeting schedules where I can wake when I feel ready. But what about the person who can't? And that's what we have to move towards, is changing these policies that allow people to be able to have flexible sleep schedules or flexible work schedules, that allows them to be able to sleep according to their circadian rhythms. And then the other pieces about that is thinking about those who engage in shift work or night shifts, how that affects their sleep. We know people that shift work tend to have worse sleep and also worse health outcomes. And then thinking about the stress of a job, right? Whether it's work demands or interpersonal stressors or conflict, or there's another concept that I study as well as others, goal-striving stress. And this is a type of stress that tends to be unique to racial minorities of higher socioeconomic status, where they are really pushing and working harder to really prove that they should be in a certain work environment, which is the results of racism and other things that can happen. And then it's also, we have to think about how much autonomy someone has over their job and whether or not we can mitigate these things with like social support, which we tend to affect. So that can affect our sleep, as well as depending on which of those aspects it can affect or lead to circadian misalignment, and that can affect our performance. And so, in just going back to the housing environment, there are many things that we can do. And so I learned just from talking to people in my studies where they were saying, I watch television at night, and I was suggesting, not to sleep with their television on. But again, going back to safety, this was their way of promoting some noise in their environment, again, to make sure people know that someone's in the home. And so that's also emitting some level of light. So we have to think about how we can alter that. But there are ways, both at different levels, individual as well as household, as well as policy level. And then thinking about the types of the way that our homes are built, and working with urban planners, working with architects to intentionally design our homes that have proper insulation, proper ventilation, all these things to improve our surroundings that make it more promoting to a healthy sleep environment. There are certain windows we can put in, right, to reduce noise and other factors. And then the use of shades. And then also, and I know I'm hitting time here, but and also thinking about whether or not someone has a home. That's the other piece that's important to think about. So if someone is homeless and they're living in a shelter, what is that like? How can we, work to create environments or really decrease homelessness, right? In order to move people into homes. And so there's some emerging research. There's not a lot in the area, but we have seen that people that move from different shelters that are homeless, we see a reduction in their insomnia symptoms over time. And again, insomnia is this condition in which there's a problem initiating or maintaining sleep. And so we have evidence that shows when someone moves from a shelter into a more permanent housing, we see a reduction in their sleep problems, particularly insomnia. And so I'll stop there. I gave hopefully a good overview of thinking about these different factors that affect our sleep at these different levels and how we must consider them in trying to improve sleep for all people.
Thank you so much. I just am a huge fan of your work. I remember one of the first articles I ever read that made me think about even founding Project Sleep was, I think it was called Sleep as a Negotiated Process or something like that, about sleep and social relationships. And that what opened my eyes to, like, just because I'm more of a communications person and more, the social dynamics than a science person. And the science was so fascinating too, but I thank you for sharing about some of this. And I think one of the words that I saw in an article that was a workshop article that I think you were a part of, but it was a workshop at NIH perhaps. And they used the word vulnerability, that sleep is a vulnerable process. And I'd never thought of it like that, but it's just so true when you talk about safety and homelessness and whether someone feels safe to fall asleep. That vulnerability is something I don't think we really talk about at all. So,
right. And consider things like interpersonal violence, right? If someone is in an abusive relationship, so that affects so many aspects. But since we're talking about sleep here, how safe are you within your home? So thinking about that at these different levels, your home and your neighborhood environment.
Yeah. Well, you're amazing. Thank you for shedding light on all of this. And so we will get to more of a Q&A and discussion at the end, but we're really excited to have Eilís talk from another perspective, which is our architectural design expert. She recently completed her bachelor's in architecture and her bachelor's of interior architecture degrees from Auburn University. Eilís is also a Rising Voices of Narcolepsy speaker and a woman living with narcolepsy with cataplexy. She was diagnosed in 2017. And if you want her whole story, there's a beautiful video of us with her sharing her full presentation about her personal journey. And at the end of that, really, we were kind of getting to some of this stuff about how she could possibly use her role in architecture to be an advocate for sleep and sleep conditions. So Eilís, take it away and share about your work in this area so far.
Yeah, I'm so excited to be on this panel with Doctors Johnson and Roenneberg, and I think there's so much that they both have said that I've already learned a lot and have been taking notes, and there's so much that I want to comment on that they've both talked about. And I think my work in school relates to some of the things that they've been talking about, and then my personal work relates a little bit more to exploring the architecture of my built environment in my dreams and hallucinations. And lots of that involves recognizing that there's these aspects of the natural rhythms in my waking life that make an impact on how I perceive myself in space in my dream life as well. And then the physical environment and the privilege that I have to be able to go to sleep in a physically safe environment, but then how that might translate into my sleep environment, which might appear to be not as safe, but at least one is set up to be in a safe space, and then the other one, when I'm actually in these hallucinations and things like that, can become much more turbulent. But it kind of creates this interesting dichotomy that allows me the time and the space to dissect them. So I'm going to share a presentation. And you can see this okay, Julie, or someone, just a little thumbs up? Yeah, okay, cool. So I, like Julie said, am a junior architect and designer, an interior architect. And so I'm really interested in not only interior spaces, and this is a picture of a bedroom designed by Adolf Loos called Shaggy Bedroom, where the carpet and the bed are kind of one thing, and there's these curtains that creates this kind of film around the space. So I'm interested in interiors and physically the spaces that we sleep or relax in, but then also I'm interested in these sort of systemic issues that Dr. Johnson was speaking about on a more neighborhood level that we can be looking at as well. I don't talk as much about that in this presentation, but would love to speak with her about that afterwards. I have so many questions and things to say as well. But basically my scope of interest in research, and I'm going to be posing questions throughout these slides, which are just questions that I ask myself throughout my design process that I would encourage other people to ask themselves about how they feel about the spaces that they sleep, work, play, and basically become involved in. So the first being, how do you perceive your own sleepy body in space? And what does that look like for you, whether you are an able-bodied person or a disabled person, or you have a sleep disorder or you don't. And then that follows into, how can architecture and interiors facilitate healthy sleepscapes, and what does that look like on a domestic level? But then most of my interest is more so about how the domestic level has now translated into the public and corporate environments of our spaces, and how sleep needs to be viewed as something that's predictable to be space, office space. And then lastly, and most personally, from the of our dream, for me, helps me ultimately design spaces better, and also basically create a commentary through image making about what these spaces can be like, and how the brain reacts to things that are beautiful or alarming or dreamy or what have you. So the first being your sleepy body in space. And I love this picture from the Elman Residence by Paul Rudolph in New York City. And I use it to basically just create some commentary about someone with narcolepsy perceiving this space and recognizing, and someone with cataplexy, and cataplexy is one of my worst symptoms. And I have full body cataplexy. So when I have an attack, I fully go down to the ground, and how comforting it would be to maybe be in a space like this when you're experiencing a cataplexy attack, or how comforting it might be to be in this space to consider going down for a nap, and how I would perceive my body against this kind of furniture. But then also thinking about how someone without a sleep disorder might perceive the space. Perhaps it would be overwhelming or be too draining of someone's energy. They might become frustrated by these things to climb over. They might not be interested in being more horizontal, whatever it might be. So it's just kind of an interesting, thought-provoking question about how our interiors are perceived by different groups of people. And then thinking about how we can use those kinds of commentaries and questions in the design process to actually implement them into the built environment. So this is a project of mine, actually in Birmingham, Alabama, for my interior architecture thesis. We were asked to design a co-working space. And I wanted to use this as a commentary on the different kinds of work and production. So there's basically a bipolar floor plate. One half is really standard task-based working, and the other half is this sort of conversation pit that has little sunken beds, couches, pillows with some little tabletops that you can have a laptop on, but basically suggesting that sleep can be really productive, and even restful social interaction can be really productive. I know lots of people say that their best ideas come to them in the shower or when they're dreaming or whatever. And I think that that's true. And to not capitalize on that in a co-working space, which is intended to be designed for different kinds of thought and collaboration, would seem wasteful. So you can see in these drawings that these sunken pits, or actually I'll go back because I want to tell Dr. Roenneberg, there's this huge skylight on the left that goes all the way to the ceiling. So natural light comes into the space and the pit is pushed towards the windows, so that even though the pit has certain textures and materials that would suggest more restfulness and less, I guess, bright tones to try and mute the light that's coming in there, it's kind of this dichotomy inside of the space to try and facilitate as much different kinds of work and brain power as possible. And you can see in this section as well, there's an attempt to make it accessible, not just for sleepier people, but also potentially for people that are on wheels or things like that, trying to make the co-working space get as many different kinds of people and energies and creativities in there as possible. And then, like I said, most personally, I try and explore the architecture of my own hallucinations. And so on the right, I've kind of underlined some text in this excerpt, but this is an excerpt of one of my hallucinations. And usually they involve architecture, I think, because that's just my natural tendency. Certainly not everybody's does. But at least there's some kind of semblance of the environment that you're in. So in the excerpt, I'm in my bathroom at home at my house. And I'm recognizing it in my brain as being my bathroom, but actually the material palette of the bathroom is totally different to the bathroom that I know to be real in my waking life. But that doesn't make it unreal in my sleep life. And so in the dream, instead of, and part of it's a coping mechanism surely as well, instead of getting caught up in the terror of the interaction in the hallucination, I try and train myself to ignore it and look at these kinds of details to then pull from them and think later on about why I might be recognizing the marble or why the sort of low wall in front of the privacy wall for the toilet is there. And is that normal in a typical bathroom? And what does that look like? And there's a clear story coming through the window. Is that warm light against this cool tone tile? What kind of an experience is that? And why might I be conjuring that kind of space for this interaction? And what does that mean? And then taking that kind of understanding from my sleep and writing in my notes, and then using that logic to try and warp what is real and what is perceived in the architecture. So this is an image from the thesis book, and trying to examine, again, bodies in space. So in this image, typically in an architectural rendering, you're looking from a certain perspective, usually at eye level through the space. And that's not happening here, but this is intended to be someone on their back. Potentially they've fallen from that tall height that you can see at the top of the image, and they're falling down through the space, or maybe they're on their back looking up, and they're seeing and being seen, which is sort of a comment on equity as well, but trying to suggest that when we're making architectural images or designing space, looking at them from the perspective of someone who isn't at a standard viewing point or something like that. And then most architecturally, I should say, because this is a section drawing cutting through a structure, how can we build in detail dream scenes like we draw structures, and what does that look like? So this is a rest stop bathroom or a gas station bathroom that I designed using characters and figures and ideas from my own dreams, but also the work of Salvador Dali and Gustave Doré, who did etchings for Dante, of which there's research to suggest that he potentially had narcolepsy himself. But basically looking at these different kinds of things. So there's some kind of grate in the bathroom, which would be typical for water to exit the space in a public bathroom. But then actually underneath that grate, there's a small ATM and a vending machine, which you might also find at a rest stop, but displacing them to kind of create this commentary that in the dream world, there's lots of things that are real and are tangible, but they might be misplaced or altered. And those things should be taken note of. And then also in another part of the bathroom, there's a staircase down to the toilet, which would never happen and would be wildly inaccessible. But then there's also viewing, like there's this voyeuristic windows into that toilet space, and those voyeurs are also standing over a grate. And the sink drain just drains down into this small pit underneath the sink. And I wanted to make sure that everything that I was designing here could physically be built. There's plenty of reasons, code, ADA, just general standards that would suggest that this would never be built. But there's nothing floating in the air or defying gravity or anything like that, because that's not necessarily how the built environment of the dream works. It's not totally unreal. I think what makes it particularly terrifying or interesting or dynamic or even beautiful for people with narcolepsy or sleep diseases that experience elongated periods of time in hypnagogia and hypnopompia is that the environment is not unlike the one of their waking life, but there are certain things that indicate that it's different, and trying to pick up on those and how we can use them to stimulate and design more interesting and dynamic spaces to help people really feel something in their built environment, which is what I'm trying to suggest here, that how do our images and renderings evoke these turbulent sensations in space? Because my hallucinations are one of my more extreme symptoms, I'm particularly interested in this, and I'm hoping to keep studying this in graduate school in the fall, but trying to look at the transitions between different sleep states. So from waking to hypnagogia, then to REM, to hypnopompia, to waking again. And those transitions are often where my sleep paralysis occurs, or where my subconscious brain is now having to deal with my conscious brain poking back in and things like that. And what does that transition look like spatially? Because it is a spatial transition, not only in your head, but you're also transitioning from your eyes being closed or the sun rising to then being woken up by your alarm, or maybe not, maybe the sun's coming through your window, and whatever that is, all of that, those literal factors in your waking life can play a role in how you transition from your dream back to waking again. So trying to create imagery and design spaces that simulate this ultimately, or can create a fabricated experience of what that is like. And then lastly, and most recently, especially during quarantine, been working on how the built environment can translate into 2 dimensions, and then vice versa as well. So using a hallucination about hearing a helicopter and waking up out of my bed and looking out my window at this helicopter, which isn't actually real, but experiencing that hallucination and trying to draw it and try and understand my body in my bed, sitting up in space, where are my eyes going, how far is the helicopter from the ground, what is that like, trying to assess basically my relationship to these game pieces in the hallucinations and things like that is really important to the work that I do, and then ultimately important to the work that I want to do in terms of actually designing spaces, kind of like the co-working space I showed you guys before, or a rest stop or something like that, and basically keep making a commentary on how these things could be better, but also how they could be more dynamic and experientially explosive for people to try and understand what this is like. So thank you.
Thank you, Eilís. Oh my goodness, we're getting lots of hearts and lots of thumbs up and comments. So I love that your work focuses on the transitions of sleep. You know, I think like a main message that we talked to Dr. Shelby Harris yesterday about was thinking about sleep not as just an on-off switch, you know, but much more of a transition process, and, you know, winding down and what that means for anybody. But then also in the case of narcolepsy with cataplexy, that we live in a lot of these transitions, and it's not just always being wide awake and then, you know, being passed out, but the worlds of hypnagogia, but also just being in our physical environments and not cognitively being there. So I just think that is so cool. And I think of so many intersections. You know, I started to think of like, what if we had, you know, what if there were people that were showing environments similar to yours, but showing what how racism and safety in their environment and how those impacts and in fact an environment the way you've done could be something that's so cool. So I just think there's a lot of really neat ideas. So let's see, I wanted to just ask everybody on the panel, I guess maybe a little bit more about that as thinking about sleep and the transitions and the time, um, that not just thinking of sleep as being awake or, being asleep, if there's any sort of commentary on that from each one of your perspectives.
Well, I think it's very important to understand that sleep is not just one state. What is sleep is a wonderful question. I always claim that what's the function of sleep is a wonderful question. I always claim that I have an answer to that question without going into any details yet, but it's a conceptual answer. And that answer is the function of sleep is to prevent malfunction during wake. If we want to understand sleep, we cannot just look at sleep. We have to look at sleep in context. We cannot judge when we wake up whether or readily judge if we wake up that we slept well or not well, because it's just what we feel when we wake up in this transition. And it could very well be that if I haven't slept properly for several nights and I finally get to sleep, whatever, 10 to 12 hours, that I wake up and feel really dreadful. But it still was an extremely important sleep. So the question of, and later on in the day, I will find that I actually feel much better now that I've slept, that I've caught up with my sleep. So I think we should more and more see we should look for a judgment of sleep during wake. I always compare sleep with a pit stop. So every race driver wants to win the race, but they still go and stop at the pit as part of how to win the race. And if you look at pictures of what pit stops looked like many decades ago, there were about two people and they filled up the tank because you can't have enough petrol to go through a whole race, so they have to fill up the tank. And they may have done something to the wheels or so forth. Nowadays, a pit stop involves probably 30 to 40 people just swarming around a car and doing stuff. And if we look at sleep in evolution, probably the pit stop of more of lower evolved animals has 3 to 4 people around the car, whereas we have in our sleep probably 500 workers around our car when we go into that pit stop, and they all make sure that the race will be that we will win the race. And we have to understand that sleep is a multitude of functions that are all necessary in order to win the wakeful race, and not just a waste of time.
That is so cool. I've never thought about a pit stop analogy. I have another analogy I've been thinking about that I'm a little bit scared to bring up to you because I think you're going to be honest with me. I've been thinking about whether we like to think of ourselves as just kind of individuals and like I, Julie Flagger, can do whatever I want during the day. But actually, maybe we're a little bit more like plants. Like, we need light, we need food, we need water, and we are connected to our environment. The way we think of, we care for plants, and you get a new plant, you think, how much light does it need? And also that some plants are more resilient than others. And so I don't know. I just think that the connection to our environment is something that I hadn't thought of really until I got more exposed to your work. And I just think we don't live our lives like that, thinking that we are, as our bodies are truly connected to our environments. So what do you think about my plant analogy?
I think it's a very good analogy. It, of course, is a very short analogy because what you're doing is you're moving away from everything that is an animal because you have the feeling that animals don't appreciate the environment. But of course, you're only speaking about the animal, the human animal. So plants are as far away from the human animal as you can be. And there you can suddenly realize how much the plant is part of its environment. But of course, it's a very good analogy on the other hand, because as plants, we are incredibly dependent on our environment. Just look what I said about the clock and the light. If you get light, if you go camping, you suddenly become sort of a larkish person. If you live in towns, in urban environments, and don't go outside during the day, you become an owl. You're completely a slave of your light environment. Don't ever underestimate your environment.
Wise words. Dr. Johnson?
Well said. Well said. I really don't have much to add to that. I'll just say, it's definitely important to think about how connected sleep and wake truly are. So during wake, we're building up our drive for sleep, and during sleep, we're really building up our ability to be able to perform during the day. But the additional piece that I want to add is in thinking about, as we are transitioning through our sleep period, we're going through different stages, right, that are extremely important for our health and our well-being. But in thinking about how that connects to our wake, so one function, for example, is our learning and memory. And I especially like to talk about this with young folks, especially as a professor. And I encourage my students, never do an all-nighter. Like, it's never going to work. You're never going to remember, anything. But, and thinking about that during the sleep period, that there are important physiologic activities that must occur in order for us to be able to function appropriately during that wake period. And just knowing that sleep is actually very active. Some people think about it as, oh, you're just sleep, it's no big deal. But there's actually really important, it is a big deal. There's so many important things happening. And so in just thinking about that, in terms of those activities and how that relates bidirectionally with wake.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Eilís, we have another question for you. I mean, I feel like, is there anything you want to add though about sleep and transitions?
I don't think so. I think there's a quote on the back of my book that's like, a dark room doesn't know how dark it is until there's some light in it, or it might be the other way around. But I think that kind of idea is like, when we're going through these transitions in sleep, it can feel like really exhausting, obviously, because it can be quite taxing, even just visually, with what's happening in the hallucination or the transition. But there's so much to be learned and so much beauty in having access to that kind of brain function that lots of people don't have access to. And I definitely think you can train yourself to dissect those transitions better. But I think the work that everyone in this community is doing to try and encourage people to not perceive their sleep or those transitions as being wasteful or damaging, I think is really productive and important. So basically just ditto everything that everyone else said.
We have a question for you from Ebonia, who would like to know, have you thought about using architecture as a way to educate people who do not experience symptoms that people with narcolepsy and other sleeping disorders experience?
Yeah, that's such a good question, because my architecture thesis project was designed basically to create a commentary that lots of the current building stock that we have is just based off of pro forma, which basically means it's meeting these standards and is designed to be bigger, better, cheaper. And there's lots of reasons why that's unsustainable, both environmentally and culturally. But I was suggesting that people should and do demand more from their built environment, and that architects can play a role in that. So basically, I have this suggestion that there's a certain fetishization of fear, and people are interested in environments that they might not always have access to, and definitely particularly people that live certain privileged lives or live in certain environments where they're not experiencing as much perhaps day-to-day interjections into their everyday routine. Like other than my narcolepsy, I don't experience too much turbulence in my day-to-day routine or environment. But there's a suggestion that people that don't experience those interruptions potentially are interested in, you know, having that spike of adrenaline, or what is that kind of experience like? So in one of the images of being on your back falling through that space, the technical site for that project was actually in Atlanta. And that it was this idea of vertical vacancy, that there's a super tall building that just has these series of platforms and spaces, but actually that you could sort of fall through the whole thing. It's kind of like, you know, people go and experience, go to haunted houses or go to escape rooms and things like that. And those can be productive, but looking at them through a lens of a sleep environment or a dream, that trying to educate people that those experiences aren't unlike the ones of their waking life, and there aren't these magical things that happen usually. And so they look very similar to the environment of their waking life, which kind of gets into surrealism, which follows into like different art movements and things like that that are also making that commentary. But definitely, yes. And I would like to eventually design, you know, pavilions or spaces that people could go to try and experience these different things, or try and build up one of those dream scenes that I've done in a rendering. And there's other architects that have done similar things for sure. So there's precedent for that. So yes.
Yeah. I feel like that I've seen stuff recently about, well, I guess it's trendy. Maybe it's not even that new anymore. VR, you know, so virtual reality. And I saw a woman from Columbia talking about it on a panel a few years ago, talking about trying that they could use VR to help someone get the experience of what it's like to experience racism, which I thought was like really interesting. And then just recently, someone was saying that they have a headset experience like that for helping people understand what it's like to experience schizophrenia firsthand. So I think, you know, I think it's really interesting to think about how we can get people to, you know, maybe to some extent, visually kind of take in a firsthand experience from a different perspective.
Yeah, and I think trickling into that is like, and I did some VR for this project, and one of the reviewers was saying, and in the video, because I did a video for the thesis as well that included sound, there's so many things that VR can do, but there's certain things that obviously it can't do. And even I'm sure Dr. Roenneberg has maybe thoughts on this as well, like simulating light and things like that. There's nothing quite like actually feeling the sun on you and actually experiencing different light levels that sometimes VR can't simulate. And same thing with wind and sound, like you can hear wind, but to not actually feel it on your skin, you might not obviously fully get that whole experience, where if you are in a dream, you do feel that tactile sensation. And one of the reviewers, because I designed REM as well, although I didn't design a structure in it, and she was like, I wonder what it would be like in real life to trudge through REM, like if you designed a space that was just full of mud and people had to kind of walk through it. You know, that's something that you could stand at a point in VR with the goggles on and see a room full of mud, but you wouldn't actually be able to walk through it. And so I think that there's so many positives, obviously, to that, and people should continue to invest in VR and AR. But I think also taking it one step further and actually making that a physical space for people to go and experience, I think is going to be even better.
Wow. So. That's so cool. Yes, and I agree that, yeah, I can't wait to show up for the whatever. I don't know if it's going to be like Eilís's Disneyland. It's going to be something quite interesting. So when we think about like systemic change, I guess I'd love to hear, you know, oh gosh, there's so many, right? There's so many things that we've talked about. There's so much change that should be made. But if you had to choose one each, as far as like a systemic change, on a policy level, perhaps, what one would you choose?
Are you asking all of us?
Yeah.
Well, I would say have an open eye and an open mind to the positive sides of the epidemic we're going through at the moment, because it has done a lot. It does terrible things, so we don't have to talk about that. But there are side effects, let's call them side effects, which are extremely interesting, and that is suddenly employers realize that they can rely on what comes back from their employees, even if they're not in the office. Because of course, all that counts is what do you deliver, and not how much have you been in the office. And that gives, that's a huge experiment, which we have queried in a huge study. We've queried 10,000 people from many different countries, and in the end we analyzed 7,000, and it taught us that we probably can do with more sleep than we thought, or we need more sleep. I'm always hesitant to use the word need, but we could do with more sleep than we thought. Because if you look at what happened before and in the lockdown or social restriction situation, what you find is that everybody sort of migrates towards 8.5 hours. So somebody who had 8.5 hours before lockdown doesn't move, but everybody else sort of migrates towards 8.5 hours. It also showed that we can tolerate 20 minutes of social jet lag, where the discrepancy between what our body clock wants and what our social clock wants, and that's not much, but there is a tolerance. So what I would say is policymakers should look at what has happened in the pandemic and how beneficial it was to, I'm not saying we should all work from home from now on, because as Eilís said, it's not only the sun as a physical entity, but also the warmth and the wind that we need. Is we don't only need to communicate via Zoom and work at home, we also need a hug from time to time, and that's sort of the warmth and the breeze. And so, but still, we have the opportunity to look at what has improved under the pandemic, and go and run for it, make something of it. And sleep has, many people sleep with home office as they do normally on weekends. Very few people have to use alarm clocks, especially those who don't have children who have to wake up to attend virtual school stuff. So things are moving, and they're moving in the right direction. And I think that is something we should make policy makers believe in and realize.
Especially with school start times too. I don't know about if that's a thing in Europe, that's a problem, but in America, the school start times are so early. So there's a huge movement about setting school start times a little bit later.
Well, I mean, the school start times in the States are ridiculously early, especially for the teenagers who go to school before the small ones go. And the internal clocks are the other way around. The internal clocks of teenagers are late, and the internal clocks of small children are earlier. So that by itself is already a ridiculous decision. But I always say that if we had evidence-based pedagogic, nobody would go to school after the age of 13 at 8 o'clock in the morning, because what you get is somebody who falls asleep in class, and because of the internal clock not being awake, and so it's not effective. And we should judge school and pedagogic activities by how effective they are in producing people who can critically think and know something. And critically thinking is even more important than knowing.
Okay, Dr. Johnson, I know one policy change, I know it's...
So one policy change, or one, I thought you said one thing, I thought you phrased it a little differently.
All right, whatever I said.
Okay. So I started off by saying my work is in the area of sleep disparities, right? So one thing that I would hope could change, and hopefully as we work towards this, would of course be discrimination. So many of our policies, so this is more of an upstream factor that shapes our policy. So if we can eliminate discriminatory practices, we could move towards equity, for which would spill over to improving sleep, improving health, improving access. You know, all of these downstream things down to the individual could change if we can address discrimination that happens. And I'm talking by socioeconomic status, race, gender, sexual preference. All of these factors happen, and discrimination happens at the policy level that affects individuals. So if we can address that, I think that will spill over into us living in a more equitable world. And that'll spill over into policies. I talked about livable wages. You know, that's discrimination by socioeconomic status, right? And so if we can address that, we can really improve health in many factors. So addressing these root causes of health disparities.
Thank you. All right, Eilís, what do you think? One area.
I'm gonna piggyback after Dr. Johnson there, because I think for me, and where I think I can personally make an impact, is in public housing, and the United States is particularly behind on the public housing front right now, far behind Europe and specifically France. I don't remember what the statistic, but most people in urban areas of France live in public housing, and not because they can't afford anything else, but the public housing is particularly equitable, and so it's more like attractive to people and young people to be living in those kinds of housing complexes. Whereas in the United States, there's obviously systemic issues and bias that comes with the public housing that we have right now. And that plays a role in the people that live there. And Dr. Johnson touched on this, and particularly communities of color or people that are in a service industry. Like, those people are the backbone of the society. And we've noticed specifically through the pandemic, those people having to work when other people don't have to work, or facilitating other people being able to stay home is because somebody else is not, and making it possible for you to be in that environment. And so where is that person living, and what is that like? I think in my third year, I designed a housing complex in Chattanooga, and it was important to me that like light was getting into every single unit, which is not the case in public housing right now. And obviously access to light is so important for, of course, so many different reasons. But I think public housing and more thoughtful design there, which also incorporates community building, and then attitudes towards surveillance, like Dr. Johnson had mentioned before as well. What does that look like, as opposed to lights shining into people's homes? Just getting eyes on the street, filling in those communities with more people living there. You're safer if there's more people living there, as opposed to being isolated from other people or being in a suburb. You're safer where there's people watching you, there's people that can watch your kids play, there's all these things happening, where right now we design those communities sort of in one spot and just build them up instead of building them out. So I think that that's kind of something that I want to get more into in my professional practice through the lens of sleep equity, most personally.
Wow. Well, there's a lot of different approaches. And so thank you for each of what you're doing. I think we've gone over time, so I just want to, and I know it's getting late in Germany, especially, so I didn't ask you guys in advance, but we are, over this weekend of the Sleep In, we're focusing on the importance of sleep, rest, and self-care. And you know, the term self-care is kind of a interesting one. And so I had never really personally kind of understood it. I mean, I don't know, I get it and I don't. And so I just wanted to hear if you guys think about self-care in your own life at all, and what you possibly do for self-care. And so I know I didn't ask you in advance, and I'm sorry, but please tell us a little bit about that as we close out.
if you can explain to me what you mean by self-care.
Okay, so it's a big kind of term here in the US of, I guess, taking care of yourself, and doing things for yourself that are, that maybe, that it's important. It's kind of, I don't know if you've heard this thing about like putting on your own oxygen mask first before you can take care of someone else. It's the importance of just taking care of yourself and doing things that help you be a better person so that you can be better for other people. So for me, Dr. Harris that we talked to yesterday talked about exercise as being important for her self-care. She knows she needs that every day. So that's just something that she does to make sure, and she has to plan for it and negotiate time like with her husband and her kids, but she knows she needs her exercise to be the best version of herself. So maybe it's a US kind of concept.
It seems very much a US kind of concept because, of course, taking care of yourself doesn't necessarily start with your body. It starts with your mind. And it starts with the fact that if you don't love yourself, you can't love anybody else. If you don't clean out the skeletons in your closet and maybe even apologize to those skeletons, you can't really act as a person. And then the physical exercise becomes a rather small problem if you address your own self and accept your own self and use that acceptance to accept other people and to embrace other people. It sounds a bit sort of soft science, but it's very simple. You just have to know yourself and see yourself as somebody who is the only person who is in the center of your world. There's nobody else in the center of your world.
Well, I think you should,
Amazing.
I don't know if you have an audiobook or what, but you're a very relaxing voice. So I feel like you could be a inspiring like voice person.
You mean because of my voice?
Yeah, it's just like, and what you say too, and your words, but I feel like I can listen to you. You could put some audio behind that, and I feel like I would just okay. Well, it's very important words, but also, yeah. Thank you. Okay. Dr. Johnson, what do you
So that's actually really hard to follow. That really should have been our ending right there. That was amazing. So I would say, in a similar thought process, when we talk about like hoping and such, we're fixing something that's happened, right? Like we're putting a Band-Aid on something. So what I try and do for my self-care, there's a number of things, but I try to schedule my day so it's not so damaging and draining that I need to do something for self-care. Yes, there are things I do throughout my day that are just for me, but the main thing I do is try and structure my day, my interactions of all positivity. I don't schedule 5, 6 meetings in one day. That's going to be overwhelming and draining. So then I need to lay on the couch for an hour and just watch reality TV or something. So I try and do my best to have thoughtful engagements, be around people that I want to be around, talk to those that I want to talk to, and do the things that I want to do. And so all of that relates to the power of no, which it's hard to do. A lot of us are like, especially I would say as scientists, and we're all in, we're working all the time, but I set very firm boundaries and do things that are not going to put me in a situation that I need to do self-care things for. So I use no, and I do what I want to do. I leverage that in my life.
Well, that is another really important message, and another thing to say thank you for taking the time and energy today, because I know that this takes a lot of energy to do something like this.
Something I wanted to do, right? So, this is not something that is, draining to me. It was something I wanted to do, something I find important. And I'll just say this a little bit before we go. One of the reasons why it's so important to me, so I'm in the field of public health, I'm an epidemiologist, and I remember having this thought when I was a master's student and thinking all the work that we do are just for people like us to read. So other scientists, read our articles and so on. So it's really important for me to do things and share and be able to translate the work that we're doing in terms of research to disseminate it to the communities that are truly affected, the individuals that need this work. And so I love to do outreach work and make sure that what we're doing is actually benefiting people and not just, publishing it in a paper, which is important, but, making sure that gets disseminated.
Well, thank you. And you might have signed yourself up for more. I don't know. I was like kind of fangirling and being like, oh my God, maybe she'll say yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes. Eilís, any thoughts on self-care before we go?
Yeah, Dr. Roenneberg touched on it, but the technique is called loving kindness. And I only know that because I just finished like a mindfulness meditation, I guess, clinical trial in a way at Northwestern University, where we basically were taught these different modes of mindfulness. And this was specifically for people with narcolepsy. And we have to be particularly kind to ourselves because you can get bogged down by the fact that your body in some way is failing you, or you feel like you don't have enough energy to carry out tasks that other people are able to do. So you have to be particularly forgiving, which is hard and takes a lot of time to be able to get to that point. But being able to say no and surround yourself with people that love you and care for you and can remind you that you are, a rock star, even though you have these other things going on, is really important. And then also drawing for me is like my biggest self-care. So like working on my art, not just my architecture work, but working on the two-dimensional side of translating these dreams has been super therapeutic for me. And drawing and coloring is not exclusive to artists or architects. Coloring and drawing is for everybody, and can really stimulate you, but also relax you as well. So would encourage it as a practice for everyone.
And I think a good drawing at night, you can be low light, you're not having to use any screens. So yeah, that could be a good nighttime activity. So thank you guys. And thank you. I mean, if you guys check out the hashtag Sleep In 2021, you'll see lots of art and creativity that people are coming up with this weekend. So again, thanks to our expert panel for doing this. And you guys are going to love, there's so many great comments coming in about how much everyone has appreciated this. So thank you again for taking the time, and thanks to everyone for tuning in. And have a good night in Germany, and have a good rest of the day in Atlanta and Chicago. All right, guys, we'll see you later. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks again.
Thank you. Bye.